Margaret Wren was 33 years old when her husband's own brother left her broken and bleeding in the Alaskan snow, certain she would not live to see morning. Silas Wren wanted the family claim, and he was not a man who believed in asking twice. When Margaret refused to sign it over, he struck her, took what little coin she carried, and walked away into the dark, leaving her for the cold to finish. She had $11 left to her name after that. $11, a wedding ring she'd already sold, and nothing else in the world. With it, she bought the deed to the ruined Sentinel Copper Works, a smelter and mine no one else wanted, cursed in the town's whispers, abandoned for decades after a disaster no one liked to speak of. Buried beneath its collapsed floors was a vault sealed 60 years before her time, one that would prove worth more than any fortune the town of Ambergate had ever imagined, and would settle a debt owed to the dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Wren. If you have ever been counted out by people who should have protected you, and found your own way back regardless, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Margaret had not always known cold and hunger as her closest companions. She had been raised in Astoria, Oregon, in a narrow clapboard house that smelled of salt air and her father's pipe tobacco, the daughter of a customs house clerk named Elias Hollis, a quiet, precise man who kept his ledgers the way other men kept scripture, with reverence, and without a single figure out of place. Elias had no sons, and so it was Margaret who sat at his elbow each evening after supper, watching him tally manifests by lamplight, learning to read columns of numbers the way other girls learned embroidery. He taught her ciphers, too, old customs house tricks for marking contraband weights, systems of dots and dashes that meant nothing to an untrained eye but told a clerk exactly what a smuggler had tried to hide. "Numbers don't lie, Maggie," he used to tell her, tapping the ledger with one ink-stained finger. "People lie. Numbers only repeat back what people did." She did not know, as a girl of 12 copying sums by the stove, that this small inheritance of patience and precision would one day be the only tool standing between her and ruin. Her mother had died of a fever when Margaret was 9, and it was her father who raised her afterward, alone, with the help of a spinster aunt who came twice a week to see that the house did not fall into disorder. Margaret grew up practical in the way that motherless daughters of careful men often do. She could dress a wound, bake a loaf that would keep a week, and read a stranger's character in the set of his shoulders before he'd said a word. She was not a beauty by the standards of the town, being too tall and too serious, with a spray of freckles across a sunburnt nose and hands already roughened by work before she was 15. But she had a steadiness about her that men found, in their own clumsy way, difficult to look away from. Thomas Wren was one of those men. He came through Astoria in the spring of her 20th year, a broad-shouldered young man with an easy laugh and restless feet, bound north for the Alaskan territories on the promise of copper money. And he courted her with a patience that surprised her, sitting quietly while her father instructed her in bookkeeping, never once suggesting she ought to set the ledgers aside for prettier pursuits. When he asked her to marry him and go north with him, she said yes, not because he promised her riches, but because he was the first man who had ever looked at her sums and called them beautiful. They were married in the autumn and sailed for Alaska before the first snow, settling in the raw, half-finished company town of Ambergate, built up hastily around the Sentinel Copper Works, a mining and smelting operation carved into the mountainside by a hard, ambitious man named Josiah Kestrel. Thomas found steady work as a timberman, shoring up the mine's deeper shafts, and though the labor was punishing and the winters longer and colder than anything Margaret had known on the Oregon coast, there was a kind of dignity in the life they built together. A small cabin with a good stove, a garden she coaxed out of thin mountain soil each brief summer, and neighbors who, for all their hardship, looked out for one another in the particular way that isolated people do. Margaret kept the books for a handful of the town's small businesses on the side, the mercantile, the boarding house, even the company store when its regular clerk fell ill. And she became known, quietly, as a woman whose figures could always be trusted, even when the men who employed her could not always say the same of themselves. It was, she would later think, the happiest and steadiest 6 years of her life, and she did not know enough then to be grateful for how ordinary it all felt. Because ordinary, she would learn, is its own kind of treasure. The winter Thomas died came on hard and early, a season the old-timers still spoke of as the worst in memory, when the fever that swept through the camp took 11 men in a single month, Thomas among them. Margaret buried her husband in the frozen ground above Ambergate, with her own hands half numb from cold, and she told herself, in the raw weeks that followed, that grief was a debt she would simply have to pay slowly, in small installments, for the rest of her life. What she did not expect, what no one had warned her a widow in that country should expect, was that Thomas's older brother, Silas, would arrive from the Southern Territories within the month, full of soft words about family duty and hard demands about the homestead claim Thomas had filed jointly in both their names. Silas had never cared for his brother's choice of wife, had never troubled to hide his belief that Margaret was beneath the Wren name, and now, with Thomas gone, he saw in her widowhood not a tragedy to be mourned, but an obstacle to be removed. The claim, modest as it was, sat on land the Kestrel Copper Company had quietly been buying up for expansion, and Silas meant to sell it out from under her, before she'd so much as finished her mourning. Margaret refused him. She had every right to refuse him. The deed bore her name as plainly as her husband's, filed and witnessed and legal in every particular her father would have recognized. And for 3 weeks Silas tried persuasion, then threats, then the kind of wheedling cruelty that men like him mistake for charm. When none of it moved her, he came to her cabin one evening in early spring with liquor on his breath, and the deed papers already forged with her signature, copied badly beneath his own, demanding she simply confirm what he claimed was already done. She told him she would see him in front of a magistrate before she signed away anything of her husband's. And it was then that Silas Wren struck her. Once, twice, enough to put her on the frozen ground outside her own door, and when she did not immediately rise, he took the little money she kept hidden in a tin behind the stove, left her there in the dark, and told himself, walking away into the trees, that the cold would finish what his fists had started, and that no one in a town as rough and forgetful as Ambergate would ever trouble to ask. Too many questions about a widow found dead of exposure. She was found instead by Ezra Colt, an old dog musher who carried the mail route between Ambergate and the coastal settlements twice a month. A man in his 60s with a face like weathered leather and a heart, as it turned out, considerably softer than his manner suggested. He nearly ran his sled straight over her, huddled as she was in the shadow of the trees at the edge of the road, and it was only the sudden agitation of his lead dog that made him stop at all. He carried her back to his own small cabin, packed her wounds with the rough skill of a man who had doctored more injured animals than people, but knew the principles were much the same, and nursed her through a fever that raged for 4 days before it broke. When she was well enough to speak, she told him what had happened, though she did not yet have proof enough to bring before any magistrate, and Ezra, who had buried 2 wives and outlived most of his friends in that unforgiving country, simply nodded and said, "Then we'll see what's to be done about proof." It was Ezra who told her, some weeks later, once she was strong enough to walk the length of the town again, that the county was auctioning off the old Sentinel Copper Works property, the mine itself, the smelter building, the assay office, and some 40 acres of mountainside for unpaid taxes going back to the disaster that had shuttered it 18 years before. No one wanted it. The mine had a reputation by then that no rational buyer cared to purchase along with the deed. A cave-in 1898 that had killed 12 men in a single afternoon, and a persistent local belief, half superstition and half plain grief, that the mountain itself did not want to be dug into again. Josiah Kestrel had collected a substantial insurance settlement after the disaster, closed the operation within the year, and left the territory not long after. And in the 2 decades since, the buildings had simply stood there, rotting under the snow, taxes accumulating, until the county decided it would rather have a few dollars than an empty ledger line. The auction, when it came, drew exactly one bidder. Margaret had $6 left from selling the last of her jewelry and 3 months of laundry work. And when the auctioneer, more out of formality than expectation, asked if anyone present would offer anything at all for the ruined Sentinel Works, Margaret raised her hand and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she would give $6 for the whole of it. The auctioneer laughed, not unkindly, and told her she'd bought herself a haunted mountain. And the small crowd that had gathered mostly to watch laughed along with him, certain the widow Wren had finally lost what little sense grief had left her. She did not much care what they thought. She had nowhere else to go, and a mountainside of ruined buildings, however cursed the town believed it to be, was at least a roof, or the promise of several roofs, and 40 acres in which a woman with nothing might begin, slowly, to build something of her own. She moved into the old assay office in the first week of summer, the smallest and most intact of the Sentinel buildings, and spent her first weeks simply clearing it of 2 decades of dust and mouse nests and the particular loneliness of rooms too long empty. It was in the 3rd week, prying up a section of warped floorboard that had buckled with age near the old assayer's workbench, that she found the first true clue, not gold, not silver, but a single brass key, tarnished nearly black, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth alongside a torn half-page of ledger paper covered in figures and marks she did not, at first glance, recognize. The handwriting was not English in its letter forms at all, and the numbers followed a system her father had shown her once, almost in passing, as an oddity from the old Russian trading days along that coast before America had ever purchased the territory. A cipher used by Russian-American company clerks to record goods and debts in a code meant to be unreadable to anyone outside their small circle of trust. Margaret sat with that scrap of paper for 3 nights before she understood what she was looking at. Her father's old lessons came back to her slowly, the way half-forgotten things do when circumstance forces them to the surface, and by the 4th night she had worked out enough of the cipher to make sense of a single repeated phrase, a name, Sorokin, and beneath it, a series of measurements that could only be a location, expressed in the crude paces and landmark style of a man laying claim to something he intended to find again. She asked Ezra, on his next visit with the mail, whether he had ever heard the name, and the old man's face went thoughtful in a way she had not seen before. He told her that his own father, one of the first Americans into that country after the purchase, had spoken of a Russian prospector named Mikhail Sorokin, a fur trader turned copper hunter who had worked that very mountainside decades before any American company arrived, and who had vanished from local memory sometime in the 1850s under circumstances no one now living could rightly say. Some claimed he'd died in a rock slide, others that he'd simply walked into the interior and never returned, and a few of the old-timers swore he'd been cheated of a fortune by men who came after him and never breathed a word of what they owed him. The deeper Margaret dug, first through the assay office's remaining papers, then into the smelter building itself, and finally into the mine's collapsed lower gallery, which she cleared inch by cautious inch over the course of that whole summer with a lantern, a shovel, and a stubbornness that surprised even her. The clearer the shape of the old story became. Josiah Kestrel, it turned out, had not discovered the Sentinel vein through his own prospecting at all, as the official company history claimed. He had purchased the site cheaply from a settler who had stumbled across Sorokin's old workings, complete with the Russians' crude but meticulous survey marks, showing a copper deposit of extraordinary richness, running deep into the mountain. Richer, by Margaret's own careful reading of the old assay figures she found buried in a strongbox behind a false wall in the smelter's foundation, than anything Kestrel had ever publicly reported to his shareholders or his workers. Kestrel had built his fortune, and the whole of Ambergate's brief prosperity, atop a deposit whose true value he had deliberately understated for years, paying his miners' wages calculated against a modest vein, while quietly banking the profits of a vein worth many times that. And when the 1898 disaster struck, a cave in that Margaret's careful reading of the mine's own maintenance ledgers suggested had followed months of ignored warnings about unshored timber in the exact gallery where the richest ore ran. Kestrel had collected his insurance, buried his dead with a public show of grief, and left the territory a wealthy man, while the widows and orphans of Ambergate were left with nothing but a shuttered company store, and a mountain no one dared touch again. Sealed in that same strongbox, wrapped alongside the assay figures, Margaret found something that struck her harder than any ledger of stolen profit could have. A small leather journal, water-stained but legible, written in Sorokin's own hand in a mixture of Russian and rough English, describing not only the richness of his find, but his intention to share it fairly with the local families who had guided and fed him through 2 brutal winters, families to whom he had promised a portion of whatever the mountain gave up. He had set aside, he wrote, a store of gold dust and coin against that promise, sealed it in the very vault beneath what would one day become the smelter floor, meaning to return for it once he'd secured proper title to the land. And then, by whatever misfortune the mountain or the years had dealt him, he never had. 60 years, by Margaret's reckoning, had passed since that vault had last been opened. 60 years in which a debt of honor had sat forgotten and untouched beneath the floor of a mine built by men who never knew, or never cared, what lay beneath their profits. Word of Margaret's digging did not stay quiet for long in a town as small as Ambergate, and it reached, inevitably, the ears of Bartholomew Kestrel, Josiah's son, who had inherited what remained of his father's mining interests, and had no wish whatsoever to see old questions about the Sentinel disaster raised again in public. He came to Ambergate that autumn dressed like a man twice as wealthy as he actually was, and he called on Margaret with an offer he framed as generosity, a sum of money, modest but more than she had seen in years, in exchange for the deed to the Sentinel property, and more particularly, for her silence about whatever she believed she had found in those old ruins. Margaret, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the truth beneath a column of tidy figures, understood exactly what kind of fear disguised itself as generosity, and she told him, with a calm that unsettled him more than anger would have, that she had no intention of selling. Bartholomew's civility did not survive that refusal for long. Within the week, rumors began circulating through Ambergate that the widow Wren had lost her wits out there alone on the mountain, that she was digging for ghosts in a mine that had already claimed 12 lives, and that decent people ought to keep their children well away from her. It was around this same time that Silas Wren resurfaced, drawn back to Ambergate by whispers that his brother's widow had somehow come into money, or the promise of it, and he arrived not with an apology for what he'd done the previous spring, but with a fresh set of demands, now backed by a hastily hired lawyer, and a claim that the original homestead deed, the one he had tried and failed to forge a year before, entitled him to a share of whatever Margaret now possessed. He had not counted on Ezra Colt, who had quietly kept, all that time, the torn scrap of bloodied cloth from Margaret's coat the night he found her, along with a written account of her injuries and the date he'd found her. Evidence enough, once placed before the territorial magistrate, to have Silas's earlier assault formally charged rather than simply whispered about in taverns. Margaret had not sought that reckoning for herself so much as it arrived on its own. The way debts of that kind eventually tend to, once enough honest people are finally willing to speak the truth aloud. The winter that followed was the hardest of Margaret's digging, both literally and otherwise, as she worked to shore up the collapsed gallery enough to reach the sealed chamber Sorokin's cipher described. Hauling timber with the help of two of the old miners' widows who had begun, cautiously at first, and then, with real conviction, to believe her account of what lay beneath the mountain. It was Prudence Yates, who had lost her own husband in the 1898 disaster and had spent 18 years keeping a small boarding house on grief and stubbornness alone, who finally stood up at a town meeting that winter and said plainly what half of Ambergate had already begun to suspect, that if the widow Wren was digging for ghosts, then perhaps it was time the rest of them stopped pretending the mountain's ghosts didn't deserve an answer. It was a turning point Margaret had not engineered and could not have engineered alone. It came instead from years of quiet trust she had built, without ever meaning to, as the woman whose figures could always be relied upon. And now that same reputation stood behind her when she needed it most. The chamber, when they finally broke through to it, in the thin gray light of a February morning, was smaller than Margaret had imagined, and more ordinary, in its way, than 60 years of legend had made it. A low room cut into the rock, dry as old bone, holding a scattering of Sorokin's tools. A second, more complete set of his survey papers, confirming a vein of copper ore that ran deep and rich enough, by the estimate of the mining engineer she and Prudence brought up from the coast that spring, to be worth in the neighborhood of $200 million over the course of its working life. A figure so large it took the engineer 3 tries to say it aloud without his voice catching. And beside the survey papers, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff with age, sat the promised store of gold. Not a fortune beyond imagining, but a solid, honest sum. Exactly the kind of thing one careful, honorable man might have set aside for people who had kept him alive through 2 hard winters and asked for nothing but fairness in return. What Margaret did next was, to her own mind, the least remarkable part of the whole story, though it was the part that would be spoken of longest in Ambergate. She did not claim the gold for herself, though the law would have allowed her every dollar of it as owner of the land. She brought the survey papers, the assay figures, and Sorokin's journal before the Territorial Mining Commissioner in the spring, laid out the full history of Kestrel's suppressed wages and the disaster's ignored warnings with the same patient precision her father had once used on customs manifests, and demanded not personal restitution, but a formal reckoning, a reopened inquiry into the 1898 disaster, and a legal claim against Bartholomew Kestrel's remaining interests sufficient to fund a settlement for every family who had lost a husband, father, or son in that collapsed gallery. The commissioner, faced with evidence too precise to dismiss, ordered exactly that. And Bartholomew Kestrel, unwilling to see his father's name dragged through a public trial, chose instead to settle quietly and substantially, rather than risk the alternative. The gold Sorokin had set aside, Margaret divided among the local families whose grandparents had guided him through those first hard winters, tracked down with Ezra's help through old church and trading post records, fulfilling a promise 60 years overdue almost to the season. With her own rightful share and the mine's confirmed value now drawing legitimate investors eager to work it honestly under her ownership, Margaret did not leave Ambergate for softer country. as many in her position might have. She rebuilt instead a proper schoolhouse where the company store had once stood, a new boarding house for Prudence, with rooms enough that no widow in that town need ever again wonder where she'd sleep through a hard winter, and a small office above the Mercantile, where, in the years that followed, any woman in Ambergate who needed her books kept honest, or her figures made to tell the truth, knew she could come and find Margaret Wren waiting with a lamp lit and a ledger open. Silas Wren stood trial that same spring for the assault Ezra's testimony had finally brought to light, and though the sentence the territorial court handed down was modest by the standards of later years, it was enough, in that small and watchful town, to mark him forever as the man who had left a good woman to die in the snow and been caught out by his own greed for his trouble, a verdict the town remembered far longer than any court record could. We began this story with a woman left for dead in the Alaskan snow, certain by every measure the world offered her that she had nothing left worth living for. No husband, no family willing to protect her, $6 and a haunted mountain no one else would touch. And we told you, at the start, that something sealed away 60 years before would change her life and restore a whole community, without telling you what that something was. Because the truth is that it was never really about the gold at all. It was about a promise one careful man made to people who had shown him kindness. A promise that sat forgotten under the weight of other men's greed for 60 long years, until a woman with nothing left to lose was stubborn enough, and honest enough, and patient enough with her own grief to go looking for it. Margaret Wren did not become wealthy because a mountain happened to be rich. She became remembered because, once she found that wealth, she chose to spend it settling debts that were never hers to begin with. And in a country built as much on forgotten promises as on copper and gold, that choice was its own kind of fortune, rarer by far than anything buried in the ground. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Margaret's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that being counted out is not the same as being finished. And we'd love to know in the comments below about a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off. Until next time, stay close.